Hello, this video is part two of two videos on putting dates on the New Testament narrative books. Let me share my screen. Okay, dating the narratives part two. If you didn't watch the first video on this subject, the first 5 books of the New Testament are primarily narratives. This is a brief review. You have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts. The previous video talked about the connections which exist between the narrative books. First of all, strong and obvious connection between Luke and Acts, and the connection is that Luke was the author of both of them. Clearly, he wrote Luke first, and then he wrote Acts second, and probably pretty close in time, one right behind the other. And the second obvious connection is that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a real close connection, but the way that that was formed, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the way that they were developed, the connection isn't at all obvious how it happened. Many different theories have been suggested, and in the previous video, I talked a little bit about a few of those theories and some of the strengths and weaknesses of them. When it comes to putting a date on these books, there's 3 kind of obvious points, and there's a dilemma along with these points. The first point is that most people think that Mark was the first gospel written, and that the date on it would be something like 65 to 68 AD and written in Rome. And when I do a special video on Mark, I'll talk about why they think that, but most people would put it 65 AD, some maybe a little bit later, and written in Rome. The other obvious point is that Luke, based on the ending of the book of Acts, looks like it was clearly written about 60 or 60 to 62 AD in that time frame when Paul was in prison. And then the third point was that Mark was a source for Luke. In other words, Luke had Mark's gospel and used it. But wait a minute, I just put 3 ovals on the screen, and if you look at them and try to run through the logic, they can't all be true. And so from the point of view of the synoptic gospels and putting a date on it, this is a little bit of a dilemma that most all scholars who have wrestled with the problem have tried to solve. And it forces you to look at 3 points which are pretty obvious and reject one of them. And so what most scholars have done in rejecting one of them is they have rejected the Luke one and said that Luke must have actually been written later than that, even though it doesn't look like it. And by putting Luke later than that, they, if you're from a secular point of view, that gives you a happier situation because it moves the Gospels further away from the life of Christ and further away from having eyewitnesses. Now, like I said, I have not looked at it like that. I think that actually the idea that Luke was written first, that Luke was not written first, but Luke was written about 60 to 62 AD is an extremely strong case. In a video that I developed that will be just on the book of Luke, I will talk about why that's a strong case. It's more than just the way the book of Acts ends, but there's very strong evidence that Luke was written at about this time. I also think that Mark was a source for Luke. And so you would think that I would reject that third one, but I don't. I also think that Mark was written, the version which we've got was written in Rome and a little bit later than the book of Luke. And the reason that I think I can put checks on all those 3 things is because I believe that the version of Mark, which we have, which is the Roman version, was not the first time Mark wrote his gospel. I think that he probably wrote that and revised it several times. Let me explain a little bit further. If you have Jesus, his earthly life, it ends about 33 AD with his death and resurrection. And then if you've got a milestone out there a little bit later, the first gospel written in the 60s AD, then you have almost 30 years in between. And So there's this gap of 30 years or so. And let's ask, is that really reasonable that Jesus' death and resurrection would then be followed by a gap of 30 or so years when nobody wrote anything about it? That, I think, is not reasonable. I've been in a room where a normal Christian asked a Bible teacher about that. They said, doesn't it seem strange that they went so long and didn't write anything? And the knowledgeable teacher would answer by saying, and you know, he probably had a degree at a seminary or whatnot, that, well, it may seem a little bit strange, but you know, we have very strong evidence that the first Gospels were not written until sometime later. And Mr. Normal Christian kind of nods his head because you can't really challenge the teacher, but you can see that deep down he feels like that just doesn't match with his intuition. Well, and I think I've actually been in that room twice when something like that happened. And you know, actually the intuition of Mr. Normal Christian in that kind of scenario is right. That kind of gap is not reasonable. And I don't believe that the New Testament even really teaches it that way. For example, I have Luke written in 60 to 62 AD, and that is almost 30 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. But look at how Luke begins his gospel. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, and it goes on. Luke is saying that he's not the first to do this. You know, Luke writes this gospel based on, he's a Gentile and he wasn't an eyewitness, but he has been going around with Paul, and he's spent by now a couple of years in the land of Israel, mostly when Paul was in prison there. And Luke has had a chance to talk to people. So Luke now has sources and information that he can use to write a gospel, but he's saying that he wasn't the first. He says that there were eyewitnesses from the beginning who wrote first, and it's in plural. He says many. I believe that Luke used Mark and Matthew and even other sources along with that. When I do my video on Luke, I will go into more detail on what all I believe he used. So let me tell a story about what I think happened with Mark and Matthew, and start with an analogy. I work as a contractor at NASA and in Johnson Space Center in Houston, and I work in the Mission Control Center area. And nearly 30 years ago, I began writing a document which was for one of the large systems used to support the space shuttle program, and then later the space station program, and it was expanded after that to support some other programs. Well, I wrote this in the 90s, and it was done in the presence and with cooperation from a great many other people who were expert on various areas. Some of them knew more about their subject area than I did, even when I was writing this document. So I wrote the document. It was pretty good size. And as soon as I had completed it, it got very thoroughly reviewed. After a little bit, there were a number of comments which came in. It wasn't too much longer before I produced revision A of the document. And then not long after that, I did revision B. And over the next several years, I did several different revisions. And since then, I've moved on and worked on some other things, but the document is still in use. Some other people have been in charge of it. And now we're up to about revision P or something like that. I mean, it's been revised about 20 times. Well, that is actually what happens if you write a document in the presence of many other people who know a great deal about the subject. Well, I would suggest to you that that's the same sort of thing that happened with the early New Testament Gospels. They were written in the presence of many other people who knew Jesus and were eyewitnesses. And as soon as Mark or something wrote a gospel, then it was read by the other people, and they had some comments on it. And Mark didn't write it just one time. He would have had time to write additional copies for other people. And when he did that, he probably changed it a little bit along the way. Let me tell you an imaginary story. This is a story about an early church in Jerusalem, And this is a made up story, but I'm going to use it to illustrate the kind of thing that I think happened. Once again, not a real story, but yet realistic. And I think it would show the kind of thing that would have happened. So say you're in the early church in Jerusalem and you go to a service there and Barnabas is preaching. And Barnabas is happy to introduce his message, which is going to be on the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he says this morning, he has the privilege of using a manuscript that was written by his nephew, Mark, along with a little bit of help from Peter. And they're going to be actually reading that and using that as a guide, as a gospel guide for the message which he's given. And so Barnabas preaches the message. And afterwards, people go up to Barnabas and thank him for the message. And a few people go to talk to Mark and thank him for developing his message. And after the crowd begins to trickle away after a great deal of time, 3 ladies come up and speak to Mark. And they come up to Mark and they say, Mark, we really, really appreciate what you wrote. It's so meaningful. And thank you for including that. But the lady in the middle says, I have one thing I would like to ask. You know, you got to that part about the ladies who went to the tomb. And this is Salome who's speaking to Mark. And Salome says, actually, the ladies that went to the tomb to see the body of Jesus and anoint his body, actually, I was one of them. And Mark said, oh, okay. And Mark said, I tell you what, next time I write a copy, I'll put your name in there too, Salome. And Salome beams with pleasure and they go away. And the first version of Mark didn't mention Salome's name, but the next version that he writes, he mentions that Salome was one of the ones who was in the party that went to see the tomb on Easter morning. Now, so of course, if you look at the Gospels, you see that Matthew doesn't have Salome and neither does Luke or John, but Mark does. And so then Mark goes over and talks to Peter, and Mark said, Peter, did I lay it on a little too thick about your denial there? You know, I looked over at you when Barnabas was reading the part about the rooster crowing, and Peter says, well, Mark, it's okay. I'm glad you put that in there. That is absolutely what the church needs to hear. And so I'm actually glad that you put it in there. And I did turn a little white. He said, you know, actually, the rooster crowed twice. And Mark said, twice? And Peter said, yes. I remember because every morning I wake up and I hear that rooster across the street crow, and I just wait for the second crow because it reminds me, Jesus actually said twice and the rooster crowed twice. And so Mark thinks, okay, next time I write this gospel, I will say twice about the rooster crowing. And so what happens is, just like sometimes when I use our church directory, I don't pull up the latest revision of it, even though we have much easier way to get latest revisions out. We can email them out to everybody. It's much more difficult to do that in the early church. And so later on, Luke comes along and Barnabas and Mark have gone off and they have the latest version, and Mark is working on a new version, but Paul has the previous version of Mark, and Paul has that with Luke, and Luke uses the previous version of Mark, which doesn't mention Salome, and it doesn't say that the rooster crowed 3 times. So Luke uses a version of Mark, but it's not the same version which goes with Mark and is kept till a little bit later. I'll talk a little bit more about revisions and how there's some evidence for that when I give an individual video on Mark and on Matthew. So anyway, this is just kind of a framework for how I'm going to discuss the dates for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I have more that I want to present on each one of those 3 Gospels, but I wanted, before I discuss those 3 in general, in detail, I wanted to present in general how I thought they developed, so that it would be a framework for the overall picture of how the synoptic Gospels develop. So the conclusion that I have is, I believe that Matthew and Mark wrote first. They wrote very early after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is not realistic to think that they would have written years later. The Jews were the people of the book. They were highly literate. Many of Jesus's disciples could read and write, and certainly for the early church, they would have written almost immediately after the death and resurrection of Christ. Those gospels were read in the presence of other people who knew Jesus, those other people would have commented on them, and that would have led to multiple copies and revisions coming in from other eyewitnesses. Furthermore, this is also a consideration, and I'm not going to go into this very much because it's just too complicated, but we can't be certain that the first versions of Matthew and Mark were written in Greek. One of the early church fathers said that Matthew was written first in Hebrew. Most people don't really think that that's right, but it's complicated. And I think we should just set that to the side, that it's possible that in the case of Matthew and Mark, they may have written in Hebrew or Aramaic first. I don't think that that's the case for any of the epistles in the New Testament, the epistles of Paul or anything. Those are all clearly written in Greek from the beginning. But for the Gospels, it's a little bit, it's not quite so simple. So I think that Luke used Matthew and Mark and also other sources, which we'll talk about in the next video. I do think that the version which Luke used was not, in particular, the revision of Mark, which we have today. The Mark version, which we have today, we could call the Roman version, which was developed for the church in Rome. So thank you for watching, and I hope to come back soon. I believe my next video will be on specifics for the Gospel of Luke.